We're back. You are listening to TurboCharge Your Business on the #1 global business talk and news network on the internet, IBGR, International Business Growth Radio. I'm your host, Patty Lawrence. This is episode 51. It's a cycle. Analyze. Be sure to go to our website at ibgr.network and download the show notes. So, last time we've talked about monitoring. We also talked about measuring. So, to recap, when we talk about the business financial management cycle, we start at, we'll call it 12 o'clock on the face of a clock, talk about measure, and then we move over to, say, 2 o'clock and do monitor, right? Measure, monitor. Now, the third step at about 5 o'clock is analyze. So that's what we're going to talk about now, analyzing. What does that actually mean? So is basically taking what you're measuring and what you're paying attention to in the monitoring and asking why, right? Analyze always begins with why. Why? Why this? Why that? You feel like you're a 2-year-old, right? You feel like you're a toddler. Why? Why? And it's not just because, right? There's actually an answer that we're going to come up with to the question of why. And so, how do we do that? Well, in the last segment, we talked about monitoring, we talked about measuring even before that. And those numbers or data sets come to us. And we talked about monitoring versus a benchmark or versus trend lines, right? So we're going to calculate, we're going to do some math here, right? And ask why. So we're going to calculate variances to those benchmarks. So if we've got benchmarks that say we're supposed to be at a certain place and we're at this place, then we do a little bit of math. What's the difference between those two, or variance? The difference is also the name can also be called variance, difference or variance. What is that? What does it mean? Why is there a variance? Why, oh, why? So when we go back to look at that, what we're trying to do is determine the root cause, right? So when we ask why, then we're kind of unpeeling the onion a layer at a time, peeling that back every time to reveal what is the root cause of that variance. Why are we operating in a certain way that gives us this result versus what we had expected? And when we ask why, that's when we start unpeeling the onion, right? Delayering that onion one layer at a time to try to figure out what the root cause could be. So there's many different measurements that we're monitoring, right? Many. We may not just have them on our dashboard. That's all. But there's tons of data out there in our organization. Tons and tons. Depends on how big you are, but and you may not even be tracking it. But I guarantee you there's a lot of answers out in your organization. So whether it's shipping, receiving, production, your technicians, if you have technicians, it's the people who answer your phones, it's the people who are out in the field, the people who are delivering services. It doesn't really matter if it's HR, if it's finance, if it's accounting, if it's manufacturing, if it's engineering. It makes no difference. There's data. You just have to collect it, because that's where your answers are. That's where you're going to find the answer to the why question. So remember, these are all kinds of different data sets, right? You can choose, right? You can choose in your organization what's important. When you analyze, you can go back and grab any data that's going to lend itself to an answer. So remember, the question of why, you're always in search of the answer. And the answer is probably not going to be in a gilded envelope, right? That somebody's going to hand to you. You're going to have to dig for it, maybe, right? You're going to have to go in search of. You're going to have to go figure out one clue at a time what happened, why, right? You kind of know what happened. Actually, the data's telling you something went awry, but you're not understanding why. And so analyzing more data is going to hopefully, knock on wood, give you the story behind the number, right? That's, to me, that's what we're in search of. Always. When we do analysis, we want the data to reveal the story behind the numbers. And what's important here, again, this is kind of a wrap up of our entire season in this cycle. And when we analyze, we are taking into account a lot of what we've already covered in previous episodes. So we're covering looking at the income statement. We're covering looking at the balance sheet. We're covering looking at common ratios. We're looking at all kinds of different metrics that are going to be able to support our analysis. And by going back and understanding what those different numbers and what those different metrics tell you about the performance, either operational performance or financial performance of your business, probably both because they're linked, you're going to be able to have a better picture of what's going on and answer the question why. But remember, we'll do a rewind, right? We'll go back in the Wayback Machine and remember that the foundation of this is your chart of accounts. Do you remember that? So, if your chart of accounts is set up properly as part of the underlying foundation of your accounting records, and your transactions are being recorded consistent with that chart of accounts, then that's going to lead to reports that you can trust, reports that are consistent month in, month out, day in, day out, and comparable, right? That we can use as a basis to analyze. And we can get our answers more easily, more readily than having to go back and recast numbers, reformat reports because they aren't comparable. Because if you go back 2 years or 3 years, is that data consistent or consistently recorded with how you do it today or last year? That's a big question. And I pause on that because I'm going to challenge you and your organization to look back and make sure that your data is comparable. Now, things change over time. I get that. Your business is going to change over time. Maybe you're expanding. Maybe we're all getting smarter, right? We're getting smarter. It's like, oh, I heard Patty talk about that. And you know what? We need to measure that. So let's break it out and get an account for that. Well, what you should do is also look back and see if you can break it out for at least 1 year previous so that you can have that benchmark, right? You have at least one benchmark that's going to be helpful to your business so that you can analyze, right? So, just to recap, in the cycle, we measure, then we monitor, and then we analyze because we're trying to determine the root cause. The root cause is going to answer our why. When we ask why is that number the way it is? Why do we have that kind of variance? That's going to help us understand. And it's going to inform us as to what we need to do next. So we're going to take a short 2-minute break. And when we return, we'll be talking about it's a cycle, course correcting and coaching. But be sure to check out my collection of free resources at turboexecs.com/turbocharge. And you can continue the conversation with me, Patty Lawrence, on LinkedIn. You've been listening to Turbocharge Your Business and episode 51. It's a cycle, analyze, on IBGR. I'm Patty Lawrence, and we'll be right back after a short break.